The banker told her to sell half while she still could. The neighbor said she wouldn't last one harvest. Her brother-in-law drove out from Decatur specifically to tell her it was too much for any woman to handle. She didn't answer a single one of them. It was March of 1973. Her husband had been in the ground 11 days, and she had 1,750 acres of Illinois black dirt that needed to be ready for planting in 6 weeks. Spencer Cooper here. The woman who made that decision is gone now. But what she did with those 1,750 acres, with old iron, with no hired men, and with every neighbor watching and waiting for her to fail, that story deserves to be told. And I've been wanting to tell it for a long time. Her name was Evelyn Schroeder. She was 41 years old. She was the daughter of a German immigrant farmer who had come to central Illinois with nothing but a willingness to work. She had married a man named Walter Schroeder when she was 22, a big, quiet man who ran a corn and soybean operation in Macon County. And in the 19 years that followed, she had been beside him for all of it. She knew every field. She knew the soil. She knew what the old 40-20 sounded like when it was pulling hard and what it sounded like when something was wrong. She could read a crop better than most men in that county, and most of them didn't know it because she let Walter do the talking. Walter died of a heart attack on the 1st of March, 1973. He was 46 years old. He was out checking a fence line in the south field when it happened. Evelyn found him at dusk. Now, I want you to understand what March of 1973 meant on a farm like theirs. The world had just changed. The Russians had bought grain, lots of it. The year before, the Soviet Union had entered the American market in a way nobody had seen before, and the grain deal that followed had turned the commodity markets on their heads. Corn that had been sitting at $1.20, $1.30 a bushel for years, it jumped to $1.57, then $2. Then by spring of 1973, it was pushing $2.55. Soybeans hit nearly $6 a bushel, then climbed towards $7 before the year was out. Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture, was telling every farmer in America to plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out, he said. The land would support it. The market would reward it. Every acre of ground in Illinois was suddenly worth more than it had been the year before, and every year it seemed to keep going. 1,750 acres of good central Illinois farmland in March of 1973 was worth somewhere around $1 million. It had been worth maybe half that 5 years earlier, and it was going up. That's what the banker saw when he called Evelyn Schroeder 2 weeks after the funeral. He wasn't a cruel man, he was a practical one. He said, "Mrs. Schroeder, you have equity in that ground that most people never see in a lifetime. The market is strong. If you sell the south parcels, 600-700 acres, you could pay off everything, bank a comfortable sum, and farm what's left at a scale any hired man could manage." That's what he said. He meant it as kindness. Evelyn thanked him for calling. Then she hung up and went back to the shop where the 40-20 needed its front axle checked. Drop a comment right now. City and state, where are you watching from? I want to know who's here for this story. The equipment Walter left her was not new. That's important to understand. The John Deere 40-20 had come off the assembly line in Waterloo, Iowa in 1968. 91 horsepower at the PTO. A 6-cylinder diesel that would run forever if you kept up with it. No cab, no air conditioning. Just an operator's platform, a canopy, and the sky. It was a good tractor. It was a paid-off tractor. In 1973, the neighbors were looking at the new Generation 2 line that Deere had just rolled out. The 4430, 125 horsepower, with the SoundGuard body cab that sealed out the noise and the dust and the heat. Those cost around $20,000 to $23,000 new. Some of the bigger operators in Macon County were already signing papers for them. Evelyn's 40-20 cost nothing. It was hers. The combine was older still, a John Deere 55. If you know your history, you know that machine. Introduced right after the Second World War, it had been a standard of the industry for decades. The one in the Schroeder equipment shed was a mid-1960s model with the 303 gas engine, about 65 horsepower, and a 45-bushel grain tank. It had a 13-foot grain platform and a corn head. By 1973, the neighbors were running 6600s, and some of the larger operators had the new 7700, which could handle 16-foot heads and had real cab comfort. Compared to those machines, the old 55 looked like something from a museum. Evelyn didn't disagree. She just didn't have $45,000 to spend on a new combine, and she wasn't going to borrow it. There was one more problem. Her son Thomas was 19 years old, and he didn't want to farm. Thomas Schroeder had grown up on that land, but he hadn't grown up loving it. He was smart, interested in engineering, and he had been accepted to the University of Illinois at Urbana that fall. He and his father had talked about it. Walter had told him to go, had meant it, had wanted his son to have a life beyond a tractor seat. When Walter died, Thomas felt the pull in two directions at once. He could see his mother standing in that farmyard, alone, with $1 million worth of ground and two old machines, and he knew what it looked like. He knew what people were saying. He stayed through the spring. He made sure of that. But Evelyn told him clearly, one evening in the kitchen, that he was going to school in September. She said it the way her father used to settle things. Flat, final, no discussion. She would figure out the rest herself. The spring of 1973 was a difficult one. The ground came out of winter wet, and planting was delayed 3 weeks across most of central Illinois. Evelyn worked the 40-20 herself, running the field cultivator across the ground in long passes, watching the soil, checking the moisture, making the calls Walter used to make. She hired a neighbor's teenage boy to help with some of the planting. She needed a second set of hands to manage the planter monitor and keep the seed boxes filled. But she drove the tractor herself, every acre, from early morning to after dark. People drove by. They watched. Some of them were respectful and kept their thoughts to themselves. Some of them were not that quiet about it. There was a man named Gerald Hutchins who farmed to the east of her. A big operation, maybe 900 acres, IH equipment, a man in his early 50s who had always been friendly with Walter. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, Gerald stopped by the house. He said he had a proposal. He wanted to cash rent 800 of her acres. 800 acres, he said, would be more than she could handle. He would give her a fair price, maybe $30 an acre, which in 1973 wasn't terrible, and she could farm the remaining 950 at a pace that made sense for a woman alone. $30 an acre for 800 acres was $24,000 a year. That sounded like money until you thought about what those 800 acres could produce. Corn at $2.55 a bushel. A decent yield in Macon County in those years was 110, maybe 120 bushels to the acre. 800 acres at 110 bushels was 88,000 bushels. At $2.55, that was $224,400 in gross revenue. Before costs, yes. But Evelyn could do that math in her head, and what she heard in Gerald Hutchins' offer was, let me farm your ground for $30 an acre and pocket the difference. She thanked him. She told him she'd think about it. She never called him back. What she did instead was split the farm into management blocks. She identified the ground that could be planted with a single pass of the 40-20 in the planter without moving equipment more than once. She organized her time so she wasn't wasting fuel or hours repositioning. She kept a notebook, a spiral-bound one from the farm supply store, and she wrote down every field, every date, every input cost. Walter had kept records in his head. Evelyn kept them on paper. It was a difference that mattered more than she knew at the time. The 1973 crop came in good. Corn at just over 112 bushels per acre average across the farm. Soybeans at 37 bushels. The prices were extraordinary. She sold a portion early, the rest she held into late fall, and when she settled the books at the end of the year, the Schroeder farm had done better than it had in years. Not because the land was different, because the market had changed and she had been there to work it. Gerald Hutchins drove by the combine during harvest. He didn't stop. Now I want to tell you about October of 1974, because that was when Evelyn Schroeder learned something about herself that she didn't know she needed to learn. The old JD 55 had been running hard all season. She was 2/3 through the soybean harvest, maybe 600 acres done, 400 still standing, when the combine started making a noise that she recognized immediately from the years of watching Walter work on it. A thump, uneven, from the separator. She shut it down in the middle of a field, climbed down from the platform, stood in the bean stubble in the October sun, and listened to the machine tick as it cooled. The cylinder bearings were going. She knew it without looking. The parts would have to come from the dealer in Decatur. They had them, but it would be 3 days minimum before they could get the bearing set she needed, plus the labor time to pull the cylinder and replace them. 3 days of harvest weather, with frost coming, with 400 acres of soybeans standing in the field. She did 3 things. She called the dealer and ordered the parts. She called a neighbor, a man named Carl Wooten, who farmed to the west and had an older IH-503 combine that he'd already finished his harvest with, and she asked to hire his machine for 3 days. Carl said yes. She went back out to the field and finished the day with the IH, running unfamiliar equipment, adjusting as she went. The soybean loss was a little higher than it would have been on her own machine, but it was acceptable. She didn't stop. When the bearing set arrived, she pulled the cylinder herself over 2 evenings with a manual she'd gotten from the dealer and a set of tools that had been Walter's. Thomas was there that weekend, home from his first semester at U of I, and he helped with the heavy lifting. They got the combine back together on a Sunday afternoon. She had it back in the field by Monday morning. There were men in that county who had been farming their whole lives and had never pulled a combine cylinder. She had just done it in 2 evenings, with her son, after a full day in the field. She never talked about it, but she knew. By the mid-1970s, something was happening all around her that she could see but couldn't ignore. Illinois farmland was moving. Fast. In 1973, when Walter died, good central Illinois ground was trading at maybe $600 to $700 an acre. By 1975, it had moved to $900. By 1977, it was approaching $1,800. The index data from the University of Illinois told the story. From 1973 to 1977, Illinois farmland had risen nearly 150%. The large farms around her were expanding. Gerald Hutchins had bought the quarter section to his north. Another neighbor, a man named Ray Bowman, who ran about 700 acres, had borrowed heavily to pick up 400 more acres and a new John Deere 7700 combine. Everybody was talking about land values going up 15, 17, 18% a year. The bankers were calling. The Federal Land Bank in town was actively marketing expansion loans at rates that seemed manageable, 8, 9%, fixed for 5 years, with the understanding that the land would be worth more every year you held it. Evelyn's own ground was worth substantially more than it had been when Walter died. Her equity position was strong. She had no debt. Her equipment was old, but paid for. She got a call from a land broker in early 1977. There was a 280-acre parcel adjacent to her south fields. The estate wanted to sell. The asking county who had been farming their whole lives and had never pulled a combine cylinder. She had just done it in 2 evenings, with her son, after a full day in the field. She never talked about it, but she knew. By the mid-1970s, something was happening all around her that she could see but couldn't ignore. Illinois farmland was moving. Fast. In 1973, when Walter died, good central Illinois ground was trading at maybe $600 to $700 an acre. By 1975, it had moved to $900. By 1977, it was approaching $1,800. The index data from the University of Illinois told the story. From 1973 to 1977, Illinois farmland had risen nearly 150%. The large farms around her were expanding. Gerald Hutchins had bought the quarter section to his north. Another neighbor, a man named Ray Bowman, who ran about 700 acres, had borrowed heavily to pick up 400 more acres and a new John Deere 7700 combine. Everybody was talking about land values going up 15, 17, 18% a year. The bankers were calling. The Federal Land Bank in town was actively marketing expansion loans at rates that seemed manageable, 8, 9%, fixed for 5 years, with the understanding that the land would be worth more every year you held it. Evelyn's own ground was worth substantially more than it had been when Walter died. Her equity position was strong. She had no debt. Her equipment was old, but paid for. She got a call from a land broker in early 1977. There was a 280-acre parcel adjacent to her south fields. The estate wanted to sell. The asking price was $1,650 an acre, $462,000 for 280 acres. The broker said if she didn't move fast, Gerald Hutchins was going to make an offer. She knew what that land was worth to grow corn on. She knew the yield history because Walter had talked with that family for 20 years. She sat at the kitchen table that night with her notebook, and she worked the numbers. At $2 corn, and corn had been averaging between $2 and $2.50 for a couple of years by then, 280 acres at 110 bushels per acre was about $61,600 in gross corn revenue per year. Against a payment on $462,000 borrowed at 9%, over 20 years, you were looking at around $50,000 a year just in principal and interest. Before seed, before fertilizer, before fuel, before equipment. The math was tight. It only worked if prices held or went up. She passed. Gerald Hutchins bought it. He went to the Federal Land Bank, borrowed most of the purchase price at 8.5%, and added those 280 acres to his operation. In 1977 and 1978, he looked like a genius. Land kept going up, corn prices held. He was farming 1,200 acres and had the cash flow to support it. Evelyn had 1,750 acres free and clear, the same 2 old machines, and numbers in her notebook that she kept looking at. Now comes the part of this story that I think about more than any other. It was the fall of 1977, harvest time. Gerald Hutchins had equipment trouble. His IH-1066 tractor, a 125 horsepower machine he'd bought new 2 years earlier, still had a loan on it. Blew a hydraulic line on his biggest combine head. It was a Saturday. His dealer was closed. Monday was coming, weather was threatening, and he had 400 acres of corn standing that he needed to get out of the field. He drove to Evelyn's house. He knocked on the door. He stood on her porch. This man understand what that means. He didn't fully understand yet. He would. The late 1970s were the time when the cracks began to show, quietly, at the edges, in ways that were easy to explain away if you wanted to. Interest rates were moving. The Federal Reserve had been pushing rates upward through the mid to late 70s as inflation took hold across the American economy. A farm loan that had been available at 7 or 8% in 1973 was at 10, 11% by 1978. The land bank rates were climbing. Commodity prices were still relatively good. Corn was holding in the $2 to $2.50 range, soybeans between $5 and $6. But the costs were rising faster. Fuel, fertilizer, parts. The diesel that went into the 40/20 cost more every year. The break-even on a heavily leveraged operation was getting harder to hit. Evelyn saw it. She talked to nobody about what she saw. She just kept the notebook. In 1979, a farmer named Russell Davies, 3 miles east of her, had his operating loan called by his bank. The details filtered through the community the way those things did. Quietly, in pieces, at the elevator, and at the implement dealer. Davies had expanded hard in 76 and 77, bought land at $1,600 an acre with borrowed money, financed a new combine, and when the bank recalculated his position with rates at 12%, his debt service didn't pencil anymore. The bank wasn't cruel about it, they just needed their money. Davies sold 400 acres at prices that were still good. 1979 was still nominally the top of the market, and restructured. He survived, but it was a signal. Evelyn wrote the date in her notebook. She didn't write anything else next to it. Then came 1979 and 1980, and the world shifted in ways that nobody in American agriculture was ready for. Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in August of 1979. His mandate was to stop inflation. He did it the only way it could be done, by raising interest rates until the economy stopped moving. By 1981, the prime rate hit 21.5%. Farm loan rates followed. A farmer who had borrowed $400,000 at 9% in 1976 and hadn't locked a fixed rate was suddenly looking at payments that had doubled or worse. And the collateral that backed those loans, the land, began to move in the wrong direction. Illinois farmland had peaked at an index level of 118 in 1981. By 1982, it was 109. By 1983, 99. By 1985, 74. In nominal dollar terms, ground that had been selling for $2,400 an acre at the peak was selling for $1,600, then $1,300, then lower. The equity that farmers had used to justify their debt was evaporating. The income to service the debt depended on commodity prices that had been pressured by a strong dollar and collapsing export markets was not keeping pace. The debt service ratio across American agriculture reached 46% by 1983. 46 cents of every dollar a farm took in went to debt service. That doesn't leave much for seed or fuel or food. Evelyn Schroeder had no debt service, zero. Her 1,750 acres went into 1981, into 1982, into the worst of it, free and clear. Now, I want to stop for a moment because something I said earlier, something about the physical cost of what she was doing, connects directly to something I've been meaning to tell you. There's a man I know, Dale, my neighbor. He's 71 years old, still runs his whole operation by himself, and he moves like a man 20 years younger. One evening last year, he was watching me try to get off my tractor, knees screaming, hips locked up, and he said something that I've thought about every day since. He said, "Spencer, that ain't just age. That's your joints drying out from the inside. Most men don't know it's happening until they've lost too much. There's a fluid inside your joints that keeps everything cushioned and moving right, and it breaks down over time. In men who've done real physical work their whole lives, it breaks down faster and harder. And most doctors don't talk about it until the damage is already done." He told me about something called joint genesis. I was skeptical. I've tried a lot of things over the years that didn't do a thing. But I'll tell you what happened around week 5. My wife came out to the barn in the morning, stopped and looked at me, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're moving like yourself again." She noticed before I did. That's when I knew something real had changed. If you want to try it, it's not hard to find. Right below this video, scroll down to the description. The very first link you'll see, it says click here. That's the one. Same way Dale told me, I'm just passing it along. I'm absolutely certain that if you try it too, it will work. Now, back to Evelyn. In the spring of 1982, Gerald Hutchins came to see her again. Not about hose fittings this time. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Evelyn had run her numbers on the 280-acre parcel 5 years earlier, and he told her the truth of his situation. The Federal Land Bank had recalculated his position. With rates where they were, with land values beginning to slide, his debt-to-asset ratio was getting uncomfortable. He was current on his payments, but just barely. He had a good crop in 81, a harder one in 82. His operating loan had gotten tighter. He said he was probably going to have to sell some ground. He wasn't asking for anything. He just needed to tell somebody who understood it. Evelyn let him talk. She poured him coffee. She didn't offer advice he hadn't asked for. When he got up to leave, he said, "You were right not to buy that 280 acres. I know that now." She said, "I didn't know I was right at the time. I just knew what the numbers said." He nodded and drove home. He sold 400 acres in 1983. He got $1,400 an acre for ground that had appraised at $2,200 2 years earlier. The sale covered enough of his debt to stabilize his position, and he kept the rest of the operation going. He was one of the lucky ones. Some of the men in Macon County who had borrowed hard in the late 70s didn't have the equity to absorb the drop. Banks extended what they could, restructured what they could, and eventually foreclosed on what they couldn't save. It is estimated that across the Midwest, farmland values fell nearly 50% in nominal terms from the 1981 peak to the mid-1980s trough. In some counties in Illinois, it was worse than that. By 1985, there were farms going to sheriff's sale that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations. The papers called it a crisis. For the men and women losing their ground, it was something quieter and worse than that word suggests. Evelyn drove to more than one of those sales. She didn't buy. She went because she thought the families deserved to have a neighbor present. She stood at the edge of the crowd and watched, and when it was over, she drove home. Thomas came back in 1982. He had spent 3 years working for an engineering firm in Springfield. Good work, good salary, a career that was going somewhere. He came home anyway. He told his mother he wanted to farm. She didn't ask him why. She just handed him the notebook. It took him a week to go through all of it. Every year from 1973 through 1982. Every field, every input cost, every yield number, every sale price, every equipment repair, every operating decision she had made, and why. He came to her one evening and said, "Mom, I had no idea." She said, "I know." What Thomas inherited was not a windfall and not a burden. It was a working operation in 1982, the worst year of the farm crisis, with 1,750 acres owned outright, 2 old but functional machines, no debt, and a 10-year record of profitable management. When other farms in the county were underwater, the Schroeder operation was solvent. When neighbors were watching their equity evaporate, Evelyn had watched it too. She just didn't owe anyone a dollar of it. The old JD 4020 was still running. She had maintained it every year, kept it in that shed, knew every noise it made. It had close to 10,000 hours on it by 1982, which is a lot of hours for a diesel that old, but she had been careful with it, and it showed. The JD 55 combine had been repaired and patched and rebuilt in places over the years, and it was not the machine she would have chosen new, but it was hers, and it worked. Thomas started with those machines. He would buy newer equipment eventually, carefully, with cash when he could, and with modest loans when he couldn't, always keeping the notebook, always keeping the numbers close to what his mother had taught him. By the late 1980s, when farmland values had bottomed and were beginning their slow recovery, he was positioned to buy ground at prices nobody would have believed possible in 1977. He did it slowly, carefully, the way his mother had taught him to do everything. Evelyn Schroeder farmed until she was 64 years old. She stepped back gradually through the late 1980s as Thomas took over more of the operation, but she was out there most mornings until the year she had her hip replaced. Even then, she was in the shop within 6 weeks, checking on things. She passed away in 2004, at 72 years old, in the house she and Walter had built together. The land was still in the family. Gerald Hutchins kept farming too. He came through the crisis diminished, but not destroyed. He sold parcels to stay solvent, restructured what he could, and by the late 1980s, he was farming about 600 acres instead of 1,200. He and Evelyn remained on neighborly terms for the rest of her life. He spoke at her funeral. He said, "She was the most capable farmer I ever knew." He paused for a moment and said, "I should have said that in 1973. I want to tell you what I think about when I think about Evelyn Schroeder. It's not the equipment. It's not the numbers, though the numbers matter. It's not even the particular courage of what she did in March of 1973, standing in that farmyard with an 11-day-old grave and 6 weeks until planting, deciding she was going to stay. What I think about is the notebook, the spiral-bound notebook from the farm supply store, the simple act of writing things down, dates, numbers, decisions, and reasons. A record that nobody else needed to see, that wasn't meant to impress anyone, that was just honest. An honest accounting of what she was doing and why. A lot of the men around her in those years made decisions based on what the banker said, or what the neighbor was doing, or what the land was worth according to someone who wanted to sell it. Evelyn made decisions based on what the ground could actually produce, what the inputs actually cost, and what a reasonable price might be for what she grew. That sounds simple. In the middle of a boom, when everyone around you is getting rich and your banker is begging you to borrow, it is not simple at all. It is one of the hardest things a person can do. She didn't need to prove she could farm. She just farmed. And the land, the same black Illinois dirt that every man around her was betting the future on, rewarded her for not asking more of it than it could give. That's the story. A woman in 1973, 41 years old, 2 old machines, 1,750 acres, and a notebook. And the men who doubted her had to find out the hard way that what looked like stubbornness was actually the only kind of math that works over time. If you knew a woman who held an operation like that together, your grandmother, a neighbor, someone you watched work the ground your whole childhood and never fully understood until you got older, tell me about her in the comments below. And tell me where you're watching from, city and state. I want to know who's here. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who remembers what farming looked like before everything got so big and so leveraged. These stories don't keep themselves. That's what we're here for. I'm Spencer Cooper. This was Evelyn Schroeder's story, and I'm grateful she left something worth telling.